Hi, my name is Shira Shiowitz, and I'm here to talk to you today about Megillat Esther, part of 929's 24 and 24 project. And Megillat Esther is an unusual book because it's set in the diaspora in the 5th century BCE, already in the time when there was a Jewish community and the Second Temple was already built in Israel. So Achashverosh is identified by scholars as Xerxes, who comes later in the Persian dynasty than his predecessors, Cyrus, who allowed the Jews to go back to Israel and begin rebuilding their community and their temple, and Darius, who allowed them to finish the temple. And yet, this book is set in the diaspora with no reference to the current community in Israel. A second thing that I think is intriguing about Megillat Esther is that on the one hand, it's a very familiar book. It's something that even as kids, especially as kids maybe, we relate to from the fun in the celebratory aspect of it, and also the story, the king, the queen, the palace intrigue. But what I find that's so intriguing about Megillat Esther is that despite being so familiar, it also remains very mysterious. And I want to focus in on one aspect of that today. So I'm going to share my screen now, and that will take us to where we want to go. Okay. So I actually want to hone in now on a particular pasuk, and this pasuk is one of the pivotal pasukim of Megillat Esther, which is when once Mordecai realizes the decree that Achashverosh and Haman have decreed against the Jews, and he comes to Esther begging her to entreat the king, who she obviously has power over, who she may have power over as his wife, to do something about the Jewish situation and to achieve some kind of Jewish salvation. And Esther at first defers his attempts, saying, I haven't been called in a while, and at a certain point, the king will call me, let me do something at that point. And Mordecai responds to her with a very unusual few verses. So I'm going to read them. I'll read them in Hebrew and in English, and then I will hone in on what specifically I want to talk about. So, Vayomer Mordecai lahashiv el Esther, al tidmi benafshech lehimalet beit hamelach mikol hayudim. So first he tells her, don't think about yourself trying to escape from what's happening around you by entering back into the palace where you have really built your life. Ki im acharesh tacharishi be'ed hazot, revach v'hatzala yamod layudim mimakom acher, v'at ubeit avich tovedu, umi yodea im le'ed kazot higat lamachut. Because if you're silent at this time, a salvation will be there for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will perish. And who knows if it's for this moment that you became this royal, you've achieved this royal status. And one of the things I think is so mysterious about this pasuk is Mordecai's uncertainty. Because on the one hand, he's coming as a call to action, trying to force Esther's hand, trying to tell her this is something that you need to do. And yet what's underscored here is an uncertainty about whether this will work. Also, he does tell Esther, if you don't do this, the Jews will be saved in a different way, right? Revach v'hatzala ya'amod la'yudim mimakom acher, which is actually in itself a strange section of this verse, because what is makom acher? What is another place? It almost sounds like Mordecai is avoiding, either Mordecai or the author of Megillat Esther is avoiding using the divine name, which is particularly absent in the book of Esther. But he certainly expresses, this is going to happen in any case, no matter what you do. And then at the end, there's a degree of uncertainty about Esther's ascension to the throne. Mi yodea im le'ed kazot higat lamalchut. Who knows? This might be the reason, but who knows? And I think that this led me in a way to think about Megillat Esther. I'm going to frame it with this verse, but that there's really two different approaches to understanding the book of Esther. And the first approach is I'll call human action is uncertain. Now, what does that mean? Human action is uncertain. And what I would suggest according to this approach is that the focus is actually not on what people, Mordecai, Esther, or anybody can achieve in this setting. The focus is actually on what I called here, sorry, let's see, a series of unfortunate events, which is a series that my kids love to read, and I enjoyed it myself. That's where I got that terminology. But the focus here is on events that seem to be not in the control of any action that man or woman takes. I'm going to give you a few examples. For example, here we go. This is the first one. And this would be what I would call an unfortunate event. In the very beginning of the Megillah, in Parak Bet, it's Mordecai who saves Achashverosh by informing him about the plan of Bigtan and Teresh and how they're planning to kill him. And that's exactly what, because of that, this is the very last pasuk of the second chapter. Vayivukash hadavar, vayimatzei, vayitlu shnehem al eitz, vayichtov basefer divrei yamim lifnei hamelech. So it was investigated what Mordecai had brought to the king as an informer and perhaps in his position as a court Jew. And they found to be correct. And so both Bigtan and Teresh were hung. And this was written down in the book of the King's Chronicles. Now, what's interesting there is that you'd expect the next thing to happen would be something fortuitous for Mordecai or for his nation. But then what happens next, and this is the very next verse that follows at the beginning of chapter 3, Achar dvarim ha'ela gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata ha'agagi v'naseo v'yasem et kiso me'al kol hasarim asher ito. So bizarrely, the next thing that happens is Haman, who we haven't heard his name before. The Midrash talks about references, to maybe one of the officers that's mentioned in the first chapter. But here, bizarrely, Haman is the one who is put into power. And that's why I call this a series of unfortunate events. It's not something that's predicated by human action, but Mordecai does a good turn for the king, and what happens is a bad turn for the Jews. Here's an example of later in the book where we turn to a series of fortunate events. Here's two others. Famously in chapter 6, which is almost like the turning point where things start to go, in a good direction. At the very end of chapter, here we go. So we'll start with this chapter. In chapter 6, Balayla hahu nadada shnat hamelech vayomer lahavi et sefer hazichronot divrei yamim vayu nikraim lifnei hamelech. So that night, the king has trouble sleeping. So in order to fall asleep, he orders the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. Now, in this funny series of events, there's a night, the king can't sleep. He pulls out this book of Chronicles, and he discovers in this book of Chronicles, lo and behold, Mordecai has not been rewarded for what he did on behalf of the king much earlier in the book when he informed on Bigtan and Teresh. Now, just at that moment, Haman happens to be approaching the king in the night. He's called in, and then we go into this very bizarre conversation between the king and Haman, where the king asks Haman, what do you think I should do for somebody who deserves reward? Haman, presuming that it's himself, answers with talking about the king giving his honor, perhaps representing giving over the kingship. And then Achashverosh tells him, yes, that is what we'll do, but the person is not you. The person's Mordecai, and you'll be the one to pull him around. So just a confluence of bizarre things coming together to bring together these events. Another example of these one event where one bizarre thing leads to another is later. I actually think this is a mistake. This should say chapter 8, verse 6. But this is right after Esther tells the king that it is Haman who wants to kill her and her nation. And the king is upset, and he goes out to the palace gardens. And then he returns. V'hamelech shav miginat habitan el beit mishteh hayayin. V'haman nofel hamita asher Esther alav. V'yomer hamelech hagam l'chvosh et hamalka imi babayit. Hadavar yatsa mipi hamelech upnei Haman chavu. So when the king returned from the palace gardens into this banquet room where Haman and Esther were, Haman was lying on the couch where Esther was reclined, meaning because he was begging for his life. He was asking Esther, do something about it. You put this in motion, save me. And then the king replies, The king actually doesn't reply. He cries out, "Are you trying to rape my queen while I am here in the palace?" So also, Haman was begging for his life, but the king walks in at the wrong time, and this is what he sees. And then that's followed immediately after by Harvona coming in, by Omer Harvona, Echad min asarisim lifnei hamelech, one of the king's attendants comes in, and he says, "Gam hinei ha'etz asher asa Haman leMordecai asher diber tov al hamelech omed beveit Haman gavoa 50 amah." And he says, "Well, there's this gallows that Haman has built to hang Achashverosh, and it's a very tall gallows." And the king says, "Vayomer hamelech taluhu alav." Hang him on it. And for that reason, we sing, V'gam Harvona Zachor Latov. Harvona is remembered for the good because he's just orchestrating these events that happen by a lot of different people being in the right place at the right time, almost parallel to the events at the beginning of the book, where it's all about people being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think one of the really important questions that this raises is, in light of this reading of Megillat Esther, do Esther and Mordecai create a sustainable model for future generations? Is this book now telling a story of something that should be emulated? And well, I'm certainly not taking away in this reading of Mordecai and Esther's heroic efforts, but at the same time, the picture that this reading presents is somewhat fatalistic, and it highlights really the limited control that people had, and people have in this type of situation. And they're saved. Life has no order. Government makes no sense. Salvation is achieved only through the hidden hands of God that's orchestrating these fortunate and unfortunate events. I believe, though, that there is another way to read Megillat Esther, and I'll call this one a human guidebook, or perhaps a celebration of human initiative. Now, what does this reading look like? Well, this reading would actually do the opposite. It highlights and therefore encourages human action, right? Now, specifically, we talked about this being a diasporic book. This is a confusing time. How should a Jew live in the diaspora? And Megillat Esther models the tension that a Jew lives in. On the one hand, right, living in the political arena, living close to the king, and yet on the other hand, the Jew, who is in some senses still the foreigner, has to figure out how to draw his or her own lines in the sand. So I'm going to give you a few examples about how this could be read in this way, as a human guidebook or a celebration of human initiative. Okay, so one thing that this book could be seen as giving is religious advice based again on the actions of, in particular here, Mordecai and Esther. So the first source, and I apologize for not having the English here, and I'll really just summarize it. The first source is Ibn Ezra's commentary, medieval Spanish exegete, on Esther's hidden identity. And many struggle with why Mordecai commands Esther to hide her identity. And there's a huge range of opinions about this. But interestingly, Ibn Ezra sees it as a way for Esther to be able to keep her Judaism while living in the palace, because he conjectures that if she revealed that she were a Jew and therefore she wasn't able to eat the food of the king, then that would have been a problem and she would have been forced to eat it. However, on the other hand, perhaps if she keeps it quiet, she'll have more of a possibility of, of being able to maintain her Judaism in a quiet and a subtle way. Now, interestingly, this is a very different perspective than the book of Daniel, where there is much discussion about maintaining halachic Judaism. What Ibn Ezra is bringing up here is not on the surface at all. Halachic Judaism is not on the surface at all in Megillat Esther. He's reading that into the text. But what's interesting here is that Ibn Ezra, I think, as a Spanish exegete, really kind of paved the way, in a sense, for an understanding of the book of Esther as advice for people who are living in a foreign regime where they need to hide their identity in order to preserve their Judaism. And later, this became like the community of the conversos, the Marranos, where Esther was and Mordecai were certainly role models for them of how to be able to maintain a Jewish identity while still living in a foreign environment, and what we call today, I guess, an anti-Semitic environment. Okay, another piece of religious advice, and this does not fit necessarily with this first piece, although it could, depends how you read it. But here's another piece that could be thought of as almost giving a guidebook. And here we're going to turn to Esther chapter 3. Once Mordecai hears about the decree that the Jews are about to, that the Jews will be annihilated. And let's read these few psukim for a minute. V'Mordechai yada et kol asher na'asa, vayikra Mordechai et begadav, vayilbash sak ve'efer, vayetzi b'toch ha'ir, vayizak za'aka gedola mara. So once Mordechai hears, he rips his clothing, he leaves his home, goes out to the city, and he cries a bitter cry. Vayavo ad lifnei shar hamelech, ki ein lavo al shar hamelech b'levush sak. But he comes to the courtyard of the king, and he can't come further because he's wearing this sackcloth. And in order to come into the king's courtyard, the king's area, one needs to be dressed in a dignified way. ובכל מדינה ומדינה, מקום אשר דבר המלך ודתו מגיע, אבל גדול ליהודים, וצום ובכי ומספד שק ואפר יוצא לרבים. So this is also happening in every province who's aware of the king's command. There's mourning, there's wearing sackcloth, there's crying, there's weeping. And interestingly, it is only Esther who seems isolated from this. She is in the king's palace, almost like protected by the king's fortress. And she, in fact, wants to send Mordecai clothing in order to say, no, you could come back into the king's palace. You can enter. You just have to put on the garb of the Persian Empire. And Mordecai there pushes back, and he ends up saying, apologize that the English is cut off here, but this is the verse that we began, right? Ki im tacharishi be'ed hazod revach v'atzala yamod la'yudim mimakom acher, etc. So Mordecai responds by saying, no, this isn't a time for covering anymore, as you've done in the past, but now this is the time where you need to be outward about your Judaism. And this could also be seen as a guide to Jewish life in the diaspora, how to know when to draw your line in the sand, and when things should stay hidden, and when there's a purpose, when is it necessary to be forward and be blatant about your Judaism in order to achieve salvation and destiny. And interestingly, what Esther does, if we want to take this like kind of to a step further, Esther herself uses all that she knows about politics and about the way that the king works in order to be able to achieve that salvation through an intimate knowledge of how things work in this empire and in the king's castle. Now, another piece here, there's also lots of political advice that could be taken here. I remember reading in Yoram Chazoni's book, which I think was originally called The Dawn and now is called God and Politics in the Book of Esther. But he pointed out that Mordecai could be understood as being very politically savvy. And why is Mordecai so silent in the beginning? So Chazoni conjectures that Mordecai wasn't worried about the king creating the horrific structure that he ends up creating for that would threaten the lives of the Jewish people, because the king always deferred to many different advisors. So Mordecai felt confident that in the way that the king was not, only turning to one piece of advice, there would always be people who were more reasonable and people who were less reasonable. So the structure of multiple advisors would work in his favor and in the favor of the Jewish nation. But here, things shift only beginning in chapter 3, where the chapter 3 begins, Achar advarim ha'ela, after these matters, Gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata ha'agagi v'nasehu ve'asem et kiso me'al kol hasarim asher ito. At the beginning of chapter 3, the structure of government changes, and suddenly the king takes Haman, who was maybe one of many officers before, one of many people who had the king's ear. And then suddenly Haman is elevated as the person who the king is turning to as for advice. And then that brings you really right into the next verse, where "V'chol avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech korim u'mishtachavim laHaman, ki kain tztiva lo hamelech." All the other servants of the king, all the other, courtiers of the king, and Mordecai is functioning as a court Jew here, they bow down to Haman because that's what the king told them to do. But Mordecai, lo yichrav lo yishtachaveh, Mordecai would not bow down. So why does Mordecai here not bow down? Well, because the political structure has changed. And since the political structure has changed and Mordecai sees the danger in this political structure, he now knows that he has to take a new approach. And the approach before of being there, being helpful to the king, giving the king, anything he could do to build up that empire, such as the sharing with him about the conspiracy of Bigtan and Teresh. Now Mordecai can't take that approach anymore. Now he has to take a stronger stand, and that's the Mordecai's refusal to bow down. Now, these, you can kind of take or leave any of these pieces of advice, whether they're religious advice or political advice, but this reading of Megillat Esther would say, in contrast to the first reading, which focused really on a series of unfortunate or fortunate events and our being in the hands of the divine, this reading of Megillat Esther focuses on what people can achieve, what people can achieve through their actions to bring about positive results, and in this case, salvation. And I think that this tension is real. Certainly this tension exists in this diasporic book where it's a confusing time period. And this balance between living in a foreign, and in this case, an anti-Semitic regime, along with maintaining faith and Jewish identification was was tricky, and I would say still is tricky. And I think these multiple existent readings of the book of Esther point really exactly to this tension, to this peace between these two realities. And that really is what Mordecai says to Esther in this place. He sees her on the one hand, this is the verse that we began with, he sees Esther on the one hand as having perhaps a role, right? There is a sense of, well, you as a person in your role can achieve something. And yet there's also this uncertainty, this pulling back and hesitancy to make other conclusions that this action will definitively change the results. And there's a stress at the same time on the divine intervention here, the Revach V'Atzala Yamod LaYehudim Mimakom Acher, that salvation will come, but it's not going to be through human action. Human action is limited. Salvation will come through divine action. Now, I would suggest that this theme is not just true in a book that focuses on the experience of the diaspora, but I think this is true throughout Tanakh. I'm just going to give you one other example, maybe because it's just one of my favorites here. But this is, I didn't write the source here, but this is from Jeremiah chapter 18. And Jeremiah is told to go down so Jeremiah is a first temple prophet trying as hard as he can to prevent the destruction of the temple and the exile of the Jews, which he is not successful in achieving. But he gets a very beautiful prophecy. God sends him down to the potter's house where he's watching the potter shape the clay on the wheel. And keep an eye out for this tension as we're reading through this tension between divine power and the tension between, and at the same time, the human action. So it begins, this is the prophecy that Jeremiah receives. Vayhi davar Adonai elai lemor, God's word comes to me saying, Hakiyotzer azel lo uchal lasot lachem be'Yisrael ne'um Adonai, hine kachomer biyad hayotzer kenatem biyadi be'Yisrael. Right? Like this potter, can I not do to you? Just like clay is in the hands of the potter, so too are you in my hands, people of Israel. And this we're actually familiar with from our liturgy because we say this on our high holidays. And what we're saying here is, right, that is we focus there in that verse on divine power. What are we? But we're but clay in the potter's hands. And divine power is unlimited, and God can do to us whatever he wants. And that's what's captured in our liturgy when we take that verse out of the book of Jeremiah. What's interesting is that it goes on. And if you read the next few verses, 7, 8, and 9, then God continues here and says, Rega adaber al goy ve'al mamlacha lintosh v'lintot lahabid, v'shav hagoy hu mirato asher dibarti alav, v'nichamti al hara'a asher chashavti la'asot lo. Right? In one moment, I decree on a nation that I will destroy them. And then when that nation returns to me, then or they return from the evil that they've done, then I regret, or I take away the evil that I had planned to do against that nation. And then it continues. The next two verses are the converse of that. That rega ataber al goy va'amam lecha livnot v'lintoa. 1 minute I speak about a nation to build them up, and then when they do bad in my eyes, then I regret the good that I plan to do to them. And I think these verses 7 through 10 emphasize a different theme, which is that the clay in and of itself here has its own power. And I think this is true from potters. I'm not a potter myself, but that the clay, a potter always works with the clay itself, and the clay itself, so to speak, almost has a power of its own. And that's what's stressed here in the second piece, which is that humankind determines their own fate, because when they, based on their actions, right, that ultimately determines the fate that will be given to them by God. And I think this tension is it's very clear here, because it follows one after the other, beginning with the divine power and then ending with human power, and how human power has the possibility to manipulate the divine. And I would say here that, just given these strange circumstances that we're in, I definitely feel that I'm living in that reality right now, where on the one hand, there's a sense of the divine power in a way that I've almost never felt before. We're living in a time where I feel very dependent on God, and prayers for me, seem more like meaningful and important than ever before. And yet at the same time, I feel like we live also in a world of human action, where the actions of people also feel more important than ever before. And the control that we have, despite our lack of control, yet there's also a lot of control in what we do on even on a very specific medical level, that we have things in our hands that we can do. And there's this tension again, between what can we do as humanity, what's in our hands, and perhaps there's also these emotional things that we can do, which include, not just the medical pieces of advice, but how to, create a sense of community despite feeling a lack of community, and yet still that feeling of the divine power and the limited piece of our own actions.